What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise and another Warhammer 40k Tech Talk. This is the video series where we take interesting or important lists from the competitive Warhammer 40k scene and break them down in agonizing detail. If you like this series, remember to like and subscribe to the channel for more. I'll apologize ahead of time. This video is probably going to be a little bit echoey. As you can see, we're just moved into a new studio. I haven't really yet soundproofed it yet, so there's going to be some weird audio idiosyncrasies, but hopefully it will mean that we'll be able to make some cool in-person content in the not-too-distant future. So I do apologize ahead of time, but please bear with me. In today's Tech Talk, we're talking about the list that may very well be the single best list in Warhammer 40,000 right now. This past weekend, we saw it in action at the Austin US Open, where it put Richard Siegler in the top spot of this enormous event. But even better than that, this archetype of list appeared 3 times in the top 8 of that event, and 4 times total in the top 16, beating out all of the various hive mind builds that are becoming more and more popular since the release of Warzone Octarius, and the ubiquitous Quad Dread Knight Grey Knights build that has been taking down GTs for the last couple of weeks. The list in question is Drukhari Homunculus Covens, and focuses almost entirely on super tanky Drukhari Coven units such as Grotesques, Talos, and Kronos. Since the list was so well represented and Austin was such a long event, unlike most Tech Talks, I'm not going to go through every single matchup that Richard Siegler played with his version of the list. Instead, we'll touch on some slight variations of the list that also topped out the event, starting with Richard Siegler's version that came in first place. This is a triple patrol variety of Drukhari, bringing 1 detachment out of a custom Homunculus Coven using the Artists of the Flesh ability. This is a super powerful subfaction trait that gives damage reduction to all non-vehicle units in the detachment. And since there are no vehicles, that means everything is going to have the equivalent of that Duty Eternal effect. That's being led by a Homunculus with Master Regenerist to allow him to heal additional wounds when he uses his healing ability, as well as the Animus Vitae, the grenade that, if it deals damage, can count the army higher on its track for power from pain. That's bringing a ton of racks, an absolute avalanche. 1 unit of 18 racks with an Ossifactor and Electric Corrosive Whip, as well as 3 units of 5. That's followed up by 2 units of 4 Grotesques. These guys are just absolute thick boys with that damage reduction, on top of a 5+ damage ignore roll and 4 wounds. That means getting through each individual Grotesque is going to be ridiculously difficult, and with 8 of them alongside a bunch of racks who also benefit from that damage reduction, which makes their damage ignore roll a little bit more impactful, although being 1 wound, obviously it's not as big of a deal as it is on the multi-wound units. That means this list can absolutely dominate central objectives, being able to flood them with objectives secured or just ridiculously tanky bodies, and making it very hard for your opponent to profitably engage. That's followed up by 2 units of 2 Talos. With 5 attacks apiece and a pretty good profile, Talos are the frontline combatants of the Homunculus Coven builds. While Grotesques and Racks are not that bad all in and of themselves, the Talos definitely bring a little bit more hard-hitting punch, alongside those 2 Heat Lances, giving each of them the equivalent of an 18-inch range Meltagun. Although they're only ballistic skill 4, so those Meltagun attacks aren't particularly consistent, the fact that you're able to put some heavy firepower at that medium range is pretty strong. Now that firepower is complemented by the 2nd patrol detachment in the list. This one also a Homunculus Coven, but this time coming out of a Dark Technomancer's build. Dark Technomancers is the ability that allows you to supercharge your weapons, non-liquefier weapons, it's important to note, to give them +1 damage and +1 to wound at the cost of potentially suffering mortal wounds on hit rolls of 1. If you have an auto-hitting weapon, obviously that doesn't really matter. We have a Succubus in this detachment. She's been upgraded to a Show Stealer and bringing Quicksilver Fighter for the additional attacks, as well as the Triptych Whip. Another unit of 5 racks, as well as 2 units of 3 Kronos. Now the Kronos is a super weird one. They come stock with a pretty mediocre melee ability that, in fairness, if it kills people, it's able to heal or regenerate models, which is good for keeping those rack units topped off, although you're not really relying on it because Kronos only come in with a weapon skill of 4. The big showstopper here is the Spirit Siphon ranged attack on the Kronos, a 12-inch range, strength 5 AP2 flamer that has a rending style ability, adding additional damage on wound rolls of 6. Now, what's important to note is that the Spirit Siphon is not a liquefier weapon, meaning it can still be triggered with Dark Technomancers. That allows you to get +1 to wound on it, meaning it's wounding almost everything in the game on 4s. and makes the weapon deal 2 damage at its base. Because its rending additional damage style ability is a replacement effect, it will actually come into play before the +1 damage modifier that Dark Technomancers gives you, meaning that these Spirit Siphons are going to be potentially 3 damage if they roll any 6s to wound. While it's not quite as efficient as the liquefier shooting that we saw spammed right at the release of the Drukhari Codex early on, these Spirit Siphons are still a force to be reckoned with, and definitely give Kronos something to do, again at that mid-range. And with 2 units of 3 of them, alongside Spirit Probes that give reroll 1s to wound in melee, allowing them to support the other units that are fighting over that central area of the table, that's actually a ton of damage coming out of this small Dark Technomancers build. Following that up, we have a Cabal detachment coming out of Cabal of the Black Heart. That's basically to unlock a Court of the Archon. It's bringing an Archon with Ancient Evil, the Fight Last ability, as well as the Jin Blade. He's been upgraded to an Overlord, so he gets access to that double fight, and also unlocks you 1 court. This time, Richard's bringing 4 Slith and 4 Urgles in that Court of the Archon. All of them are hyper-efficient wounds with a 5+ damage ignore, which is definitely the theme of the army. Courts of the Archon are absolutely phenomenal, and especially in Cabal of the Blackheart, allowing them to advance and charge on turn 1, meaning that if you go second, they can potentially deploy somewhere in the center of the table, and you can charge with them to get access to central objectives early. Just makes them an incredibly useful unit. The Archon himself, being a fight last effect, is also nice to have on top of that, and it's bringing another unit of Rax and 5 Mandrakes to do some utility. Now, immediately we can see that this list is a complete overhaul of the normal Drukhari archetype that at this point we're very used to seeing at top tables. Gone are the days of spamming raiders and agile MSU combat units. Now, we're tanking up the table with damage reduction stacked on top of damage ignore rolls. On top of the homunculus passive aura to give +1 toughness to any of the core Coven units within 6 inches of him, that means that each of those Talos Pain engines or Kronos Parasite engines is almost going to be the equivalent of a Space Marine Dreadnought when you're trying to deal with it. Even better, since it has that 5+ damage ignore rather than a 6+ damage ignore you could get from something like Black Templars or Iron Hands, meaning that for a very low cost, each of those individual models is extremely difficult to deal with, and can deal a ton of damage itself. This is a response from the faction to a couple of factors, the most obvious being the rebalanced data slate that was released a couple weeks ago. With the increasing cost of almost all of the previously staple Drukhari units, including Raiders, Incubi, and Witches, the previous versions of Drukhari were made significantly less powerful. However, these homunculus units largely received points cuts, which makes them a lot more palatable. The popularity of Grey Knights and, to a lesser extent, Orcs, although their builds are changing significantly in response to both the data slate release, which changed how they interact with their buggies and aircraft, and the release of Warzone Octaria's Critical Mass, which gave them their Speed Freaks Army of Renown, were also contributing factors. Classic light infantry Drukhari builds have almost no way to contend with the quad Dread Knight Grey Knight archetype, which brought such a withering fusillade of efficient raider and infantry killing firepower that Drukhari had a super difficult time making positive trades or actually holding the middle of the table. Turns out, when you give every single one of your Space Marines a Stormbolter for free, and have those 4 Dread Knights, each of which is very capable of killing a Raider by itself, especially alongside the psychic support that the army can bring, it's super difficult to survive in the middle of the table as a Drukhari player. We've streamed that matchup over on twitch.tv/TacticalTortoiseTV a bunch of times, and it's gone very poorly for Drukhari every time. You can actually see some of those VODs over on the Twitch replay channel, youtube.com/TacticalTortoiseTV. Check it out. Hashtag always be plug-in. Now we'll move on to talking about some of the other versions of this archetype that we did see in the top 16 of the US Open in Austin. Anthony Vanella brought a version that was a little bit less focused on the big rack and grotesque units and a little bit more on just straight up dealing damage and trading units. This one also being a triple patrol build with significantly less racks on the table and only 1 big unit of grotesques instead of Richard Ziegler's 2, but we have 2 units of 3 Talos rather than 2 units of 2, giving you access to that additional firepower and melee punch, as well as Drazhar instead of the Succubus in the Dark Technomancer's patrol detachment. Drazhar being the Warlord, giving him access to his Eternal Hatred, meaning he's full rerolling his hit and wound rolls every time he makes those 2 swings in melee. I don't think I have to talk too much about how much Drazhar is a beast. He's an absolute monster, and definitely be scared of that guy. We also do see a Raider in the Cabal of the Blackheart detachment, probably to ferry the Court of the Archon around, but we could also put that big unit of 10 Hemoxites in there if we want to as well. Colin McDade also squeaked in the top 8 at 8th place with another similar version, this time, however, being a little bit more of a classic version of Drukhari. This one was a real space raid detachment, bringing an Artist of the Flesh Homunculus Coven alongside Cult of Strife and Cabal of the Blackheart. For those who don't know, this is a special battalion detachment that's available only to Drukhari and allows you to retain your subfaction abilities of all 3 different varieties of Drukhari subfaction, as long as you bring the 3 leaders for them, meaning you have an Archon, Homunculus, and Succubus all in the HQ slots of that battalion detachment. It also gives the Archon the ability to extend his reroll 1's aura to everything in the detachment, which is also pretty cool. We also see a ton of racks in this list as well, bringing a unit of Homoxites, as well as 2 units of base 10 racks, 5 Cabalite Warriors, and 5 Witches. We see 2 units of 5 Grotesques, the most grotesque we've ever seen out of any of these lists, alongside some Mandrakes. And, interestingly, following up those Talos is a Ravager, to give the list a little bit more long-range punch. That's being followed up by another patrol out of Dark Technomancers with a unit of 3 Chronos, and Drazhar, although this time it's important to note Drazhar's not the Warlord, so he's not going to be dealing quite as much damage. This one obviously focused a little bit less on dominating the midboard and a little bit more on dealing some long-range damage. We have only 3 Talos and 3 Chronos apiece, rather than 4 or 6 as we saw in the other builds, but do have additional access to those powerful characters, as well as some agile objectives secured from the other infantry units. Overall, I think it's interesting that we are seeing a lot of slight variations of this list see success. That's something that we've seen in Drukhari for a while, although Drukhari previously has looked very standardized with the mass raider spam alongside the characters in MSU units. The actual composition of those units have been pretty flexible, with some players focusing more on Cabalite units, some focusing more on Witches and Cult of Strife, and obviously some focusing on the Homunculus Coven units. For the reason we talked about earlier, it's definitely the future of the faction to move into those Homunculus Coven units. And I think the decision on the balance team's part to reduce the points cost of all these units is an interesting one. Drukhari obviously have been dominant for a super long time, and their codex does have a lot of depth. There are some not great units in it, but for the most part, you can see a competitive use for almost everything in the codex, which is not something we can say for a lot of other factions. That gave the codex a lot of resilience to changes like the increase in points cost of their staple units. Although whether or not we needed to see points changes to these Homunculus Coven units that didn't see too much play, especially since, while they didn't see play, the meta was changing in such a way to be more conducive to them, not totally sure. It'll be interesting to see if Drukhari continued to dominate in this fashion in the future. It's important to note that we also saw a couple other builds of Drukhari in the top of the US Open, Sean Naden specifically bringing more of a classic version of the list, focused on Hellions and Reavers, as well as Raiders filled with Cabalite Warriors and Witches. So classic Drukhari isn't quite dead yet, although obviously that list did not win the event, and instead we saw all of these different builds of Homunculus Coven list. So if you're playing competitively, remember to keep in mind that it's not only Raiders we're going to be seeing out of Drukhari anymore, we also have to deal with these super duper tanky styles of heavily armored lists coming out of these Homunculus Coven detachments. And that tankiness and a total domination of the midboard may make this list the best list in Warhammer 40,000. Time will tell, but I imagine that we're going to be seeing a lot of this list in the not too distant future. But anyway, congratulations to Richard and everyone who got into the top 16. We had some phenomenal games that were streamed over on the Warhammer TV Twitch channel, and we saw some pretty cool lists make it into the top there. Obviously, a lot of Forces of the Hive Mind and Pure Tyranid lists, which I appreciate because those bugs be my boys. But we also saw Imperial Knights as well as Chaos Knights, Mixed Chaos, Mixed Imperium, a little smattering of Orcs as well, all of those in the top 16, which is absolutely phenomenal. So anyway, let me know down in the comments what you think about this wildly changing Warhammer 40,000 metagame that's been created by these new balanced data slates. We are staring down the barrel of an MFM update sometime within the next 1 to 2 months, so we may see another meta shakeup from that as well, which will be interesting, and I'm excited to hear what you think about it. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also the people who are YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All y'all are awesome. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.